My name is Joy Santella Phipps. I'm the pastor here. And as you can see, I'm dressed in Revolutionary War dress. And that's quite appropriate because we're standing in front of the monument to Abel Morgan. Abel Morgan was the patriot pastor of this church. He closed this church as the British came to fight the Battle of Monmouth, which they lost and had to retreat, walking all the way out to Sandy Hook. Coming by this church, they had a number of wounded and they had a number of dying. And indeed, there's a story that one of the soldiers who died still haunts this church. But we're not really quite sure since no one's really ever seen the ghost. But Abel Morgan closed this church and he held services in his barn because he was a patriot. Abel Morgan lived a very long time, as you can see, especially for that time he died at the age of 73. He courted a young woman in this parish whose name was Sally. But Sally said she loved God first and Abel Morgan second, so they never married. However, in his memory, she always left a shell, and this shell is left by Sally and her descendants in spirit, as a memory to Abel Morgan. And here is actually the third edifice built on this same foundation. And the reason that you know it's the third building is you see the date that it was built in 1832. And that little plaque up there states the year that this particular building was put up. This particular building is on the foundation of this old 1720 church. And here we are in the historic cemetery. As we look at the cemetery, we realize that the people who are buried here are part of our nation's history. Here we have the tombstone of Reverend Abel Morgan, who was a patriot who refused to support the British, and because of that, this church was used as a hospital for the retreating British troops in the Battle of Monmouth. We also have other Revolutionary War heroes buried here. You'll see these old tombstones from the 19th century, and these are the names of the people who actually settled in Middletown. Middletown was established in 1664, and this church obtained its first permanent minister in 1688. A very famous person buried here, in addition to Reverend Morgan, was a fellow by the name of Josiah Murray. He was actually murdered by Tories. Depending on how you look at the story, he was either murdered because he stole a horse, or he was murdered because he supported the Patriot cause. And his farmhouse is down at Percy Park, and I hope that you'll have a chance to go there during your weekend in Old Monmouth and to see that particular farmhouse, which dates from the 18th century. So we have a number of Revolutionary War heroes, as I said, and their particular tombstones they're buried here in these places, and all of them have plaques stating that they were part of the Revolution or that they were part of the War of 1812. So we have this Revolutionary War hero here, placed by the Monmouth chapter of the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution. One of the real problems in these old gravestones is, of course, you'll see that you can't really see the writing in the gravestones, which is a real problem, because over the centuries, these gravestones really did not stand up to the weather very well. It's one of the reasons that gravestones moved from this old soft granite to marble, as you see over there. Also, some of these gravestones, as you run your hand over it, you'll see that the letters are actually raised rather than carved in. These actually have stood the test of time. We have other important people who are buried here. We also have Joseph Stilwell and Obadiah Stilwell. Obadiah Stilwell was very important in the life of this church. The Stilwell family was very important in the life of this town. And indeed, the town is going to name a new road after Obadiah Stilwell as well. People buried where they had to bury. And as you'll see by the way in which people are buried here, or the way the gravestones are, you'll see that they really sort of like found wherever they could possibly squeeze a body. And actually, the cemetery is on 2 levels. There is another level underneath. Bodies were buried on top of bodies. It was really quite common for that time. this wood area, which of course was much more verdant in another several weeks, is part of the grounds of the church, and it's something to think about as you're sitting out here in nature. I mean, after all, doesn't Scripture tell us when God created the earth, the first thing God did was create a garden? We're now in the process of having a gravestone restoration company come and restore several of these gravestones and hopefully be able to bring them back. Well, I wouldn't have said to life, but certainly so that they're more easily readable. So there are many famous families that were here and that are connected to this church. There was a Reverend Stout, of course, in the 19th century, who actually was a direct descendant of Penelope Stout, kidnapped by one group of Indians and then left for dead on the beach, and rescued by another Indian who took her back to his wigwam and sewed up all of her injuries with fish intestines, which was, one would grimace and wonder how you did that without some kind of anesthetic, but the people who settled this area were strong people. And then she was traded back to the English and settled in New York. But she is known as the mother of Monmouth County. She's actually the first woman of whom we have any records in Monmouth County. Now I'm going to take you inside so that you can see how this building is constructed. First, you'll notice that there's a foundation which is built with limestone. This was the way that old foundations were built back in the 18th century. This is one of the reasons that we know that this church sat on the same site as the earlier church, because in the 19th century they moved to brick. As we walk around, we'll see that this is the original clapboard, and we'll see how this building was changed over several centuries. Like many buildings in this area, our building was damaged by Hurricane Sandy. As part of the federal program for the Sandy Disaster Relief Grant, we were very fortunate in obtaining money from the Historic Trust, the National Park Service, through the Department of the Interior and the Preservation Office, in order to make sure that our church, our sanctuary building, would be completely restored and rehabilitated for posterity. The original 1832 building actually ended at these glass doors. That building was built on the old foundation, and as you saw outside, how the foundation shifted from limestone to brick. So what happened was, in the 1840s, as this church grew and as there was a change in the way people worshiped, people in this church created a set of porticos, a set of porches, and that became what is our narthex. I'm going to show you a little bit about what happened here as we go outside into this particular area. And as we go upstairs, this was originally uncovered when it was first built, and it was only closed in around 1915. Back in the 1880s, this church had a tall pin-type steeple, and that steeple got knocked over in a hurricane. We have a fully functioning bell, and as we go up the steps, you'll see the way in which the steps are curved. You'll see that it can be quite unsteady for people who have problems on steps. But let me show you a little bit about this construction. This shows you a little bit how these buildings were built. They were built and they were stuffed with horsehair and glue. That's how they created insulation. The horsehair was the winter coats of horses, and it was mixed up with glue. You'll notice that these beams are not what they call 2x4s now. They really were 2x4s and 4x6s. As we go upstairs, where we really get a nice view of the sanctuary. Now, because it was an old Baptist church, the original sanctuary didn't have these fancy windows. They really had plain glass windows. However, a pastor around 1915 decided that we really needed to have something that was more in keeping and more attractive. So he designed these windows, as well as painting this painting of the resurrection. These windows were put in around 1915, as I said, and they actually are sealed from the outside. What you can see, however, I think you can see, are the floorboards and how irregularly shaped they are. This is fairly standard for this time because the planing that was done
create the floorboards. Everything was not exactly even and conforming to our kinds of floorboards that we now have.
We're actually under the sanctuary, and here you can really see how this church was constructed. You see that the fact that the rocks were all plastered in together, and they were put in with lime cement, as I said before. And when you walk in under here, what you'll see is this is a dirt basement, and you're wondering, like, how do you keep the water out? Well, sometimes we've had problems with that very issue. You'll also notice that rather than having standard modern construction, that there are a lot of trees that are holding this church up. Fortunately, somebody came up with the idea of doing lolly columns, because if we just had the trees, the church probably wouldn't be standing. What you'll also notice is that when they're talking about 6x6s and 8x8s that are supporting this building, they mean 6x6s and 8x8s. When we put in the heating system, we had to cut a little bit of the foundation supporting beams off, and that's why we have the lolly columns. But not to be concerned, the church is not near collapse. Let's come through here. Even though I'm short, I still watch my head. This was a site of a major archaeological expedition. We had excavations here. Members of our church were included in the excavation, along with Jerry Scharfenberger, who directed the project. Jerry Scharfenberger is very active in Middletown politics and is actually now the mayor of Middletown. What he uncovered here was really exciting. Pieces of boot, a lot of musket balls, clay pipes, all in all, several hundred artifacts were found digging through this area. And every once in a while, we find something that was undetected. What we find are primarily little pieces of Revolutionary War kinds of memorabilia, one would call them, for lack of a better word, but little pieces of buckle or belt or whatever. And that's because when this church was used as a revolutionary, as a hospital for the retreating British, it was the old 1720 church. That church actually, that sanctuary actually burned down in the 1820s. And the reason it burned down was that back in those days, church fires were really quite common. The real problem was that there was obviously somebody left a coal ember burning in a fireplace, or actually it was a wood stove, and it caught fire and the whole church burned down in the 1828. So members of this church got together and they raised all kinds of money, and they pledged huge amounts of money for their day. $5 and $2 and $3, and little by little they raised the money to be able to rebuild the present sanctuary based on this old foundation. So very much like Schliemann and all of the famous archaeologists that uncovered Troy and Egypt and all of these other places, you know, you sort of like just dumped everything into the ground when the church burned down, so that there were leftover artifacts from the Revolution that were uncovered here through the efforts of the archaeological team that worked here. We have great pictures of the team members, and you'll see them upstairs as part of our exhibit. You'll see that, you know, originally this was a Baptist church, so the people were baptized by immersion. And originally, of course, they were baptized in a river, which ran behind the church. But as more and more building came into Middletown, the water table dropped and the river dried up. So in the 19th century, they thought, what we really need is indoor plumbing to baptize people. This is our 19th century indoor plumbing. This was a spigot that actually brought water up to the baptismal font, which is now not being used because right now it's covered up by organ pipes. Upstairs, there's another smaller building, and it was originally owned by the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Baptists were against strong drink because they felt that what happened with strong drink was that men were spending all of their money
all of the hard-earned money that they earned off on drink. And very often, it was a story, which was really quite true, that wives would be standing at the factory gates to make sure that the money that the husbands had earned would go for milk for the children rather than for booze for the workers. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union building, which has since been refurbished and now is our fellowship hall, was actually picked up off of its foundation and hauled up here from where you'll see the Middletown train station. And it was actually brought up on several wagons and horses and plopped right onto our grounds. And when you look at the pictures of the early church, you'll see first there's only the church, and then after about 1910, you'll see the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So in 1953, when this church was just these two separate buildings, they built a middle part, which is actually holds the administrative offices, and now has the place for the AAUW used bookstore and several other kinds of functions. And this is why the whole grounds and the building and grounds looks the way it does now. I hope you've enjoyed your tour, and if you have any questions, one of our guides will be glad to answer them. I encourage you to look at all of the documents that we have, and to remember that indeed it is part of our heritage. Whether your family was here in 1777 or whether your family came last week, what really counts is to recognize that these men and these women lived and died in allegiance to an ideal and to a principle of freedom and equality for all. It's one of the reasons that our church is an open and affirming church and stands for full equality for everybody, no matter their race, their religion, their ethnic group, immigration status, their sexual orientation, or their gender identity. What really counts, as we know, is, as the Apostle Paul said in his letter to the Galatians, all are equal. All are equal in Christ Jesus. It makes no difference.
Thank you.